Alright, I want to talk a little bit about fatty acid metabolism, okay? So, what we have going on here is fats are compounds that contain both fatty acids and glycerol, okay? So, what you have to realize is that when you talk about processes like beta oxidation, you're not really talking about the oxidation of a fat. You're talking about the oxidation of a fatty acid. So, I'm going to try and make that distinction for you here. So, what I have drawn here is a fat, okay? I have a glycerol backbone here, and I have three fatty acid chains, okay? So that constitutes a fat. Now, if I was going to talk about a fatty acid, what I would do is I would talk about severing this bond here, and just from this carbonyl group here and this long chain, hydrophobic chain here, that would constitute your fatty acid. So there would be three potential fatty acids, okay? And this is an unsaturated fat, or an unsaturated fatty acid here, if you were to cleave this off, because of the double bond. Double bonds introduce unsaturation in fats. So I just want to kind of make that distinction right off the bat, that, when you're doing these processes of beta oxidation, and things like that, you're not talking about the oxidation of fat, you're talking about the oxidation of a fatty acid, okay? Two different things. So my font's a little small here, but I'll talk about it. Fats are important in energy storage, okay? But they can also be problematic because they are not water soluble. So they're, kind of difficult to move around because so many things in the body and in cells are, have high concentrations of water. So it's only natural that, you'd rather have hydrophilic things than hydrophobic things. So, but the truth is, if you were to think for a second, this is a little bit of a thought experiment, if you were to think for a second about storing energy as fat and storing energy as, say, glycogen, what you would realize is that it's extremely important to store energy as fat for mobile organisms. And it's extremely important for organisms like, say, a hummingbird or any kind of bird for that matter, because if they were to try to store their energy as glycogen, they would never get off the ground. The amount of weight that would be associated with the amount of glycogen necessary, to power flight would be so large that it just simply would not work. So fats are extremely important in terms of energy storage, okay? And adipocytes are specialized cells that hold fat, so adipocytes, rather. I make up my own words sometimes, so I apologize. Are specialized for, cells to hold fat, and they store fatty acids, which are released by the action of lipase. So there's an enzyme that specifically starts to release the energy in fatty acids. So it starts to go through a process of oxidation. And fatty acid oxidation and fatty acid synthesis are almost the reverse of each other, but not quite. Again, they're pretty much sort of like glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. So, one process is oxidation, the other one's a reduction. And the main process of fatty acid oxidation is called, as I've been saying so far, maybe I was a bit ahead of myself, but is beta oxidation. And it occurs in 2 carbon intervals, leading to the formation of acetyl-CoA. So beta oxidation. So the main thing to take from this is that when we're looking at one of these fatty acid chains here, what winds up happening is you lose 2 carbons at a time, essentially. So each one's cut off as 2 carbons, and it's cut off, and when this oxidation occurs, the molecule that's produced is acetyl-CoA. So you end up with an acetyl-CoA molecule, and of course, if you think about it, 2 carbons, then that tells you that it's it's usually better to have a fat that has an even number of carbon molecules, because that they're in intervals of 2. And like I said, this produces acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA can enter the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. And acetyl-CoA leads to quite a bit of energy production under aerobic conditions. I mean, remember, it makes 3 NADHs, an FADH2, an ATP. So all this energy is being produced, of course, under aerobic conditions, but still, nonetheless, energy production. So fats store quite a bit of energy in them. Think about all the, say you have a 16 carbon, so you have 16 carbons. How many acetyl-CoAs can you get? You can get about 8 acetyl-CoA molecules there. And but it would only be 7 rounds of beta oxidation, okay? And I'll talk about that later, why it's only 7 rounds of beta oxidation. But still, you could produce, 8 acetyl-CoA molecules. So, that's quite a bit of energy production that can be had there. So moving on from there, I just want to kind of do an intuitive thing here. Not a lot of of detail at this point, just kind of an introduction. Fatty acid degradation, or beta oxidation. So the main process of fatty acid oxidation is beta oxidation, and it occurs in 2 carbon intervals leading to the formation of acetyl-CoA. So if you look at the pathway here, and you check this out, we have some fatty acid, okay, and we're adding this CoA group onto it, along with the use of ATP. So this is ATP hydrolysis is being used to drive this reaction, provide the energy necessary for this reaction. And then the next reaction is simply an oxidation, okay? What winds up happening here is we introduce some bond saturation. We form a double bond here. So we form an alkene, and FAD is reduced to FADH2. And the next reaction after that is a hydration. So what we do is we add water across the double bond, and you can see the H2O molecule being presented here. It goes right across the double bond and forms this OH molecule here. And then we go through another oxidation, and this time we're reducing NAD to NADH plus H+, okay? And that produces these 2 carbonyl groups here, okay, carbon double bond oxygen here. And the final reaction, the final process in beta oxidation is cleavage, okay, and by cleaving it, what we wind up with, or what in this case, is we wind up with CoA, acetyl-CoA, right here. Okay, so acetyl-CoA is our target molecule. And after that's done for the first 2 carbons, essentially the process is recycled here, as shown by this arrow. Essentially the process is recycled, and we go back up to this spot here to the first oxidation. We go right back up to the first oxidation, and we go through the process again, cleaving 2 molecules off at a time, 2 carbons off at a time, and those 2 carbons eventually become acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle and produces a lot of energy. So that's basically intuitively how beta. Now, of course, there's fancy names for all of these things, and memorizing all the intermediates and all that sort of stuff can be useful, of course. But intuitively, what's being done here is you're cleaving 2 carbons off at a time, producing acetyl-CoA from a fatty acid, okay, and that's going to enter the citric acid cycle and produce lots of energy. So in fatty acid synthesis, which I said is essentially the reverse of beta oxidation, the synthesis of fatty acids, we start with a 3-carbon molecule, but only 2 of the carbons get put on. So we start with this melano-CoA here. Okay, I don't know if you can really see what that looks like. And an acetyl-CoA. And we start with a condensation reaction, okay? A condensation reaction. And that produces beta-keto-acyl ACP, so a little bit different. And I should have said this is acetyl ACP, so excuse me for that. And then we go through a reduction, okay, which is natural because this is a reductive process. We're going to be building a larger molecule from smaller pieces. And then we go through a dehydration, so pretty much the reverse of the hydration reaction we saw. And that produces trans-2-enol ACP. And then another final reduction produces acyl ACP. And basically what's going on here is, again, we're doing sort of the reverse. Instead of oxidizing, we're reducing. And we're producing, a larger molecule from smaller parts. So that's kind of an overview of fatty acid synthesis. I'm going to talk more in detail, obviously, about both of these processes, but for now, that's where I kind of want to leave it.